Thank you to the Human Rights Center, and thank you to everyone for coming. So the name of my talk is Encountering the Drug Terrorism Nexus, Security, Law Enforcement, and the Problem of Human Rights. So over the last several years, recent attacks in Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad have thrust a region of the world known as the West African Sahel into conversations about transnational terrorism. Additionally, reports issued by Human Rights Watch and the International Crisis Group have shown the ways that organizations like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Boko Haram are also implicated in the trafficking of people and weapons. Therefore, questions of security and stability are at the forefront of conversations about the 21st century Sahel. And admittedly, this is a vast and complex region of the world, which stretches from Senegal and Mauritania in the west to Chad in the east. So over the summer, I worked with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime at the regional office in Dakar, Senegal. And UNODC Rosen oversees programs in 22 programs in Central and West Africa, and I was working mostly on the law enforcement unit, focusing on the Sahelian band of countries. So when I started this project, I had kind of three research questions. So the first is, how effective is a law enforcement framework for addressing the complex security needs of the Sahel? The second, what are the possible limitations of building law enforcement capacities in the region? And then third, what tensions and contradictions exist between efforts aimed at strengthening law enforcement capacities and those intended to build accountability and prevent state violences? And as often happens when doing field work, you arrive in country and you realize that you've been asking some of the wrong questions. So when it comes to question one, how effective is law enforcement, even the most generous research subjects that I had said there are many limitations to law enforcement, and they were happy to describe law enforcement as a very blunt tool in a limited toolbox when it comes to security issues. As far as the second, limitations, they were numerous, and again, people were really forthcoming about what those limitations were. So I kind of focused on question three, and also, I started thinking about new ways of understanding this project. So one of those new ways was this idea of the drug terrorism nexus, which is what I encountered in the office. And it was a contested hypothesis. So the hypothesis goes that groups designated as terrorist organizations in the Sahel are working with Latin American drug cartels to fund violent activities. And for some people, this was completely ridiculous, that it was a contrived, overstated hypothesis. There wasn't enough evidence to support this. And for others, they would say, no, based on reports and based on interviews that we've conducted in country, we actually have evidence to support this link. So as I'm hearing these contested debates, I started to think less of this hypothesis as something that needed to be proven or disproven, and I started to think about another question, which is, what does the contestation around the drug terrorism nexus reveal about law enforcement as a developmental strategy in the Sahel? So this is something that I'm thinking through in a draft of an article that I'm working on, and I'll give you kind of a quick taste of what I'm trying to do with this. Is essentially the US-led war on drugs, which is dated to about the 1970s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, has been widely critiqued and largely discredited in a lot of spheres throughout the world, most notably in the US, where there's been this push for decriminalization and legalization of drug use. Also in Latin America, even though there are sort of aggressive efforts to still rein in drug cartels, there's an acknowledgement that the war on drugs strategy that were undertaken in the 1980s and 1990s have actually made things a lot worse, not better. And yet, as I encountered what I saw as a revamped and reworked war on drugs alongside the war on terror in West Africa, I started to think about the ways that essentially an expertise around a certain model of policing was really indebted to drug interdiction tactics. So this is something that really became obvious when I attended a drug interdiction workshop in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. And there was this way that there wasn't a moral register about drugs are bad for society, but there was a way that thinking about drug interdiction, especially at the scale of transnational organized crime, was a way to essentially foment good policing, that this became a developmental strategy and there were things to be learned from thinking about drug interdiction that could be applied to other realms, namely terrorism. So then I kind of want to think about closing with this problem of human rights. I really appreciate the conversation that Christian brought up about sort of all these critiques of human rights. So especially in the realm of African studies, human rights is a really controversial topic. I think there's renewed scrutiny as South Africa recently announced that it would be withdrawing from the International Criminal Court. And one of the popular narratives surrounding decisions like this is that human rights have been used as a disciplinary tool disproportionately on the African continent, while powerful states have been able to shield themselves from scrutiny. And I think that critique is really important for the way that I actually think about human rights in African studies. But I also want to flag a type of problematizing of human rights that I encountered in the field that I found really troubling. And essentially the narrative is that as there's been this outpouring of funds for security capacity building through increased police, through increased numbers of border and security agents, through increased prisons and detainment facilities, through specialized military units, that all of this capacity around security has outpaced what are politely referred to as accountability mechanisms. So when I asked my research subjects, I said, how do you ensure that you're not just building the capacity of security forces to terrorize local populations? And one of the blunt answers I got is, we can't. Right, and I thought there was a way that when I talked about this as a human rights problem, people started to say things like, well, of course, as a United Nations agency, we are invested in making sure that our member states are adhering to their human rights commitments. But at the same time, the exigencies of the security situation necessitate a kind of political tact when it comes to bringing up human rights abuses. So if you need the Chadian government to be on the front lines fighting Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin, it's probably not the best time to bring up their human rights record. And I think this problematizing was something that really set uncomfortably with me. So one of the closing questions that I want to present is, how can we as scholars, as researchers, as advocates maintain a critical orientation towards human rights framework while acknowledging all of the things that it can and cannot do, while also not allowing the problematizing of human rights as an unattainable ideal to absolve foreign actors of their responsibility in laying the possible groundwork for future violence. Thank you so much for your time.